Our next speaker is a very interesting guy. He's managed to thread together a career that has social finance, social innovation, blogging, a bit of SEO, some food security, maybe some urban sustainability, little local economic development thrown in. He's currently the executive director for the Hastings Crossing Business Improvement Association, which is a BIA that's a little bit different. It's been founded with social innovation and inclusion really at its core. He's also the program coordinator for Building Opportunities with Business, also known as BOB. It's a community economic development agency in Vancouver's downtown Eastside. When he's not doing that, he's growing food in shipping containers. As the director of what's called Urban Stream Innovation, which is a food systems technology startup. So you can well imagine that he's got some academic stuff in his past. He writes a lot. He comments online very much, and he plays numerous roles all over town in boards and startups, working to make Vancouver a more inclusive and interesting place. So please welcome Wes Regan.
Thanks, Stephen. I should probably simplify my life a bit. That's where I was born, speaking of simple, in the middle of frickin' nowhere. And I spent the first 10 years of my life up there, and I spent a lot of it at this altitude looking down at rivers and trees and stuff like that, because my dad was a bush pilot up in the Arctic, which many people said at the time was not a great place to be raising kids. So they moved down here to Kelowna, which a lot of people told them at the time was the greatest place in the world to raise kids. And it took me a while to settle in. And as I grew into my formative years, I struggled to find myself. And one thing that didn't really help was the belief among a lot of my evangelical friends at the time that the world was about to end. Comet Hale-Bopp was a sign in the stars. David Koresh was the false messiah, and the Gulf War was about to descend into Armageddon. And so as I'm 12, 13 years old, this is starting to sink in, and I'm overwrought with a sense of existential and religious dread. And so I funneled that dread and that confusion and angst through my creative self into music, which became my main outlet. And I managed to make a pretty decent little career out of it, actually, over time. I toured all throughout Canada, the United States, and even throughout Japan, playing in a number of different bands in both Kelowna and here to Vancouver, where I moved eventually. And throughout my travels touring, I began to question all the different places I would visit, the diversity that I saw, whether it was the natural landscapes or whether it was the cities and regions and their nuances or the different cultures. How did they get to be that way? I became fascinated with places. And the cumulative effect of that being, how did this world get to be the way it is? This crazy, complex, terrifying, fascinating, et cetera, mystifying world. And so eventually I couldn't take it any longer, and I just said, I can't go on another tour. I have to go back to school. I have to study something relating to this. So I went back to school, and I took my first human geography class, which I fell head over heels in love with. And eventually, after transferring to SFU from Langara, I ended up working in the downtown Eastside in a co-op placement at a community economic development agency. And it was there that I began to realize, as I'm sure many of us in this room here realize, that we just can't go on the way that we've been going on. That we need to change the paradigm that we live in, that we need to push for new solutions, and we need to test the limits of what we're capable of if we are to survive or flourish, frankly. But that's a pretty daunting task, because we're talking about the 300 years of institutions, 300 years of colonization, of industrial growth paradigm thinking, and all the institutions and processes that have supported this paradigm. So pushing against that seems like a daunting task for an individual. And I began to wonder, what at the local level can I do? And eventually, I stumbled upon a group of other people who were looking at the food system and looking at food security in the downtown east side. The food system, the industrial food system, is one of the main brain children of the military-industrial complex. Incredibly wasteful, carbon and chemical intensive, exploitative, And so a group of us here in Vancouver decided to form the Vancouver Urban Farming Society. And I became a partner in a company that grows food in shipping containers called Urban Stream. And the VUFS supports companies like Urban Stream, local growers, to produce or to create a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient local food system. But because I was working in the downtown Eastside as well, between this intersection in food and the local economy, I began to wonder more and more about what sort of innovations can we see in our economy here in Vancouver. And I was working with a lot of folks who were doing really innovative stuff with social enterprises, with nonprofits, things that were against the norm, whether it was local currency, whether it was social impact employment. And eventually I had the opportunity to start a new business improvement association where we were actually able to embed these things that we saw, social innovation, inclusion, social justice, right into the Constitution and bylaws and into the mandate of this organization, as well as work with groups that were looking at social impact employment, social impact purchasing. And the more and more that I got into it, the more I realized that this city and this province is crawling with innovators. This was just a flow of consciousness. I'm like, oh, who comes to mind? And I put up some logos here. This is 1/100th of what's available in BC and in Vancouver. And I think that it's partly because we live in a city and in a province that's still in some respects on the frontier. It's a city that's discovering itself, a city that is still creating itself. And we're doing it in a pressure cooker because we've only been around for about 125 years. We've brought an incredible broad range of creative entrepreneurial people into this city. And I think that this combination, this dichotomy of this fast-paced, self-generative city nestled within this beautiful, pristine, untouched wilderness of British Columbia creates a particular type of, I don't know whether it's an urban psyche or the culture of the city, but it influences us because I think we draw a certain amount of inspiration and we are nurtured by the environment, and we want the best of both worlds. We love being an urban city in Vancouver, but we also love escaping out to the mountains or to the ocean, and we know what we can lose if we don't innovate our way forward to have the best of both worlds. We can reconcile the economy and the environment, and I think in Vancouver, and for that matter, we can reconcile, I think, the social inequality that we see with our economy. And we know that we have to in Vancouver. I love this cartoon. Because we know we can do better. Vancouver is one of those cities that is doing better, that's striving to do better. Because we know what we can lose. Because we're spoiled, and we don't want to lose that. But I think that it's important to note that it's when we localize these things that they become more tangible. When we see things like global poverty and climate change, those problems seem somewhat intractable. We're alienated from them because the scale and complexity is so overwhelming. But when we recast those problems in a local lens and we look as a city or as a community, I think it's easier for us to see a tangible future ahead that we can impact. And to me, just in closing, I think these cities that we live in are part of a global ecosystem of cities. This is my new thing I'm on right now. And if we're able to take care of our individual tree, Vancouver, and able to mobilize the knowledge that we gain from the innovation and creativity that boils up here, I think the cumulative effect of sharing that innovation, that creativity, can have a transformative effect at that broader global scale. And so working and living in Vancouver is incredibly inspiring because it's a hot spot for all this stuff. And so I just thank all of you for contributing to that. And thank you, Steve and everyone, for having me here tonight.